Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz at ClassicsToday.com, here to answer a very interesting and very fair and very, I think, basic question. One of you wrote to me and said, I've just started listening to classical music, and I really want to know, what is it? How do I do it? What do I expect? What am I listening to? How do I get started? And so I'm going to give what I hope is a really, really basic talk. So those of you who have been doing this for as long as I have, you may find this interesting, but it's less for you than it is for people who really are just getting started, who just got into it and who see this monumental ton of chunks of piles and tons of music out there. And you want to know what it is and what you're listening to. First, let's get to the basic point. The only way to really find what you like is to start listening to stuff and then listen to the stuff that you like. Now, I know that sounds stupid, but that's the truth. The way that you find music you like is by listening to it. There is no way around it. However, I also believe that it couldn't hurt to sort of talk about how the lie of the land, what the terrain is going to look like. And that's what I'd like to do with this talk in a very, very essential way. Because the issue, I think, for most people is not so much what is classical music, but rather what is music? How does it take shape, in distinction with our common expectations of what music is, because music is many things. It has many forms and many shapes. If you think about, for example, a house, a normal little house, it's a house. It's a house. It's a type of a building as a house. Then you look at a skyscraper. Well, it's a very different kind of a building, but they're both buildings. Music is like that. And classical music is concerned with, for the most part, what we call classical music in our tradition, is concerned with all of the other things music can be besides just a house. And that's what I want to explain to you in a way so that you know what to expect. So there are three basic propositions we need to address. The first is that one, what the forms of music are. The second proposition is style, the style that the music is written in, because obviously music that has existed for 500 years or 600 years or whatever we call our classical tradition, it's not going to sound the same if it was written 400 years ago as it does now. Happily, it really is the same in most important essentials, but the exterior surface, the packaging, the decoration, the paint, on the surface of the building, the shape of the windows, they're all going to be different. And you may like that shape or you may not like that shape. So that's another thing. You have to listen and decide what styles appeal to you. And then the third thing is the easiest one of all in actuality, but in practical terms, the most difficult. And that's just a question of vocabulary. Learning a language, learning what the words are that govern what you're listening to. And those you just pick up as you go. You shouldn't be intimidated or worry about those things because their meaning is often obvious and clear once you know what one is, or once you have heard something and heard someone tell you what it is. And you go, okay, that's what that was. And it's really pretty straightforward. But it can be the most off-putting thing because you're dealing with multiple terms coming from multiple languages that have existed for hundreds of years. And it's a learning process. It's a learning curve, and you just have to be willing to undertake it. So, with that said, let's talk about the first major point. That is the sizes and chunks of music. What size does it come in? How does it come packaged? What are these different buildings? Oh, I'm going to have such a good time with this because I've got a wonderful analogy that I can use. Oh, I'm so excited. You see, I can't actually play musical examples for you in this discussion because something that lasts 2 minutes and something that lasts 3 hours are not going to be the same. And I don't have 3 hours to say, oh, look, it lasts 3 hours. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it? So we're going to talk in generalities, and hopefully that will sink in a little bit. Now, so let us begin. the kind of music that most people encounter in their daily lives is either some sort of background instrumental music, like in an elevator or a doctor's waiting room or a restaurant, which we don't pay much attention to, or more specifically, songs. The song is the modern essential musical unit. And most people talk about songs in a very generalized way. I mean, I can play a Beethoven symphony and they say, oh, I like that song. Well, it's not a song. It's a symphony. There's a difference between the two. There's a difference in size. There's a difference in style. There's a difference in intention. And so you have to start to get to know what those things are. So let's talk about this in a very, very general way. First, here's a song. In addition to collecting classical music, talking about it, I collect rocks. I'm a gem and mineral person. I mean, not so many gems because they're expensive, but minerals, very interesting and beautiful minerals. Here is a song. Ta-da! See this song? It's a beautiful little song. This is actually called Creedite, by the way, and it's lovely stuff. And let's call this a song. It's very attractive. It's very pretty. It has a lovely shape. It has 3 verses, this particular song. You can see them. Songs usually come in verses. They get repeated, sometimes with different words, sometimes with the same words. Well, this one, let's say, has 3 of them, and it's a song. It's not very large. It fits in the palm of your hand like that. There you go. And it's a song. Not all music consists of songs. Songs are a thing. They are one of the chunks that music comes in, and it's the most familiar one. And it's so familiar, they're so familiar to most people that they think that all music is a song. Well, no, because if we put that down, we can pick up this. Well, what is this object? This is not a song. This is a different thing. It's actually called Smithsonite, by the way. But same Smithson for like the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, in case you're curious. And this is a zinc mineral that they used to grind up, and they make a powder out of it, which you can make a lotion into and use it for poison ivy. It's very good for your skin. Anyway, so this is not a song. This is something else. This is a bigger chunk of music, because a song is one of the smallest bits of music that we have. There are other small bits of music which are not songs in addition, but we don't need to talk about those. We just want to get the general concept here. So this is not a song. Let's call this an overture. Why not? What is an overture? Well, an overture is usually a one part, that is, it just consists of one continuous chunk, like this. It's one continuous chunk. You can play it at the beginning of a play, at the beginning of an opera, or you can just have it be separate, completely separate. As, for example, Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, which you may know. It has cannons going off and bells and things, and it goes da 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 dum bum ba da 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 dum. He called it an overture. That means it's a beginning of something, an overture, right? An opener. It's French, from ouverte, or Italian, ouverture, opening. Something to get the show going. So that is usually going to be larger than this. And it's very different from this. It will have a different shape. It will have a different form. This will have someone singing, usually about love and misery and, the opposite sex, whatever that happens to be. And this is true, by the way, of all songs. Since the dawn of songdom, we have songs going back to like the 12th or 13th centuries, and they haven't changed a bit. That's what a song is. Well, this is what an overture is. It will probably not have words. It will probably be written for the full orchestra. That's if it was written from about the late 1700s onwards. Before that, there was something called an overture, which was a completely different thing. So that's one of the things you will have to learn when you're dealing with classical music, the fact that there is terminology, which is our third category, which can mean different things in different periods, and you'll get a sense of it. But an overture is basically this. a larger blob of music, and it is not a song, and you should not think of it as a song. So now let's say you've done with your overture and you're very happy and you really like it. You love the sound of the symphony orchestra, which is one of the great inventions in the history of Western civilization. When you think about it, this aggregation of 100 people or more all doing the same thing, playing the same work and cooperating and creating music in a miraculous array of colors and variety and all of that stuff. So let's say you want to move on a little bit and you liked your overture and now you are listening to the radio and you hear a piece of music that you really like, and someone says, well, that was Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, or Beethoven's Third Concerto, or maybe it was for smaller forces, and someone said, oh, that was Haydn's String Quartet, Opus 20, number 5. These are all bigger things than overtures. It's a different chunk that music can come in, and so here is a symphony. Here it is. This is smoky quartz, actually. This is fabulously interesting. This actually has some a little dusty, some prehistoric water from millions of years ago encased inside it, which is really fascinating. Scientists use these types of crystals to examine the water and see what the atmospheric makeup of the planet Earth was back in the Jurassic Age or whatever it is. Anyway, so here is a symphony. It is bigger than the overture. Quite a bit bigger, as you can see. It's even bigger. And so you can see by this very simple illustration that music is going to come in many different shapes, just like these rocks. Different shapes, different sizes, different forms. And listening to classical music, the first thing you need to know and be prepared to do is understand that that's what you're going to encounter. That you're going to go way beyond the idea of the song and start looking at the other larger things that music can be. Now, there is a corollary to this operation, this idea, and there's no way around this. So if you think you're interested in classical music and you really want to do it, get ready. And that corollary, that other quality that you need is time. Because music is movement through time. It's sound moving through time. Any kind of music. Now, small things like songs take 3 or 4 minutes, and you may love them, but they come in small little chunks that are neatly packaged that you understand. You understand how they're going to go. You understand what they're usually about. You get it, right? Whereas symphonies and concertos, like this one, can last anywhere from, say 20 minutes or so to an hour and a half. And we're not even talking about theatrical forms, which can go up to 3, 4, 5 hours. Who knows? I mean, crazy lengths. And so in order to enjoy classical music, you got to have the time. And there's no way around it. People, like to make recordings of, classical music's greatest hits where they just play the big tunes, and those are fine. There's nothing wrong with getting just the tunes or little excerpts or things that, if that's all you have time for. But if you're serious about it, and if you really want to get into it and learn what it is, then you need to take the necessary time. Now, you don't have to spend the rest of your life doing it. You don't have to take 24 hours at a stretch. You can take as much time as you have available. I'm not saying that, it's not a punishment. It depends on what you enjoy. If you like something and you want to hear more of it, and it's okay that you spend an hour listening, you have to do that. That's what you're going to have to do. And it's a wonderful thing. I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful it is, how healthy it is. Because, in particularly in our age today, there is a total lack of confidence in our ability to amuse or entertain ourselves merely by listening, merely by using our sense of hearing just as there's an inability merely by watching. We want to see things that move. We want to see things that have a combination of visuals and music and audio. And if we could have touch and odorama and smell it, we want as much sensory input as possible for our entertainment moment. But music, great music, and classical music particularly, is of a level and quality that it is sufficient merely to listen. That is all you have to do. And for many people, that's the hardest part. Because just like, okay, I'm listening. Impress me. As you're sitting there listening and you hear this thing going and it's over, you're like, well, what was that? Either you are okay with that or you're not. And if you're not, then the truth is you're never going to get into classical music because you're going to be missing out on some of the best and most wonderful things, the things that take serious, serious time. Now, lest that sound too daunting, one of the things you should know is that classical music in big chunks usually comes in smaller pieces. And that's a good thing. Those smaller pieces can just be called a part 1, part 2, part 3. More likely than not, they will be called movements. A movement is simply a smaller chunk of a larger piece. That's all it is. It's probably the most important word you're going to have to learn because symphonies, concertos, sonatas, cantatas, all those words that I'm telling you, they're all different things. They are all made up of movements. An overture, such as this one, has one movement. It consists, the whole thing, of one movement. And a movement, it's a wonderful word, actually, movement. There's so much musical terminology that's practically meaningless in terms of what you actually hear. But a movement is well named because it indicates what you're hearing, which is the movement of sound through time. So one chunk of that is a movement. So let me give you an example. Let's say you listen to a different symphony than the one I just showed you, then a different one than this one here. Beautiful though it was. Let's say you have this one. Here's a symphony. This is Pyrite. It's a Pyrite symphony, okay? This symphony consists of movements. Well, obviously this is one giant chunk. It makes up one giant chunk of Pyrite. But the Pyrite symphony has 4 different movements. And we don't have to go into what they are or what they're called. They will have names usually designated by the speed at which they go. But we usually call them the first, the second, the third, and the fourth movement. Isn't that easy and logical? The fourth movement is often called the finale, right? It's very logical. So here is the first movement. There it is. You see, it's Pyrite. It's the same as that big thing. It's the same material. And then we have a second movement, which is often a slow movement. Doesn't have to be, but it often is. And it's more Pyrite. You see? Here's the second movement. And then there's the third movement, which is a slightly different kind of Pyrite, but it's still Pyrite. It has a bit of a different shape. It looks like it's a little simpler, because there's just one nugget. So maybe this movement's a little simpler. And then you've got the finale. Here it is, the finale. This is another chunk of Pyrite, which also looks quite different from the other ones that we've seen. But it is all Pyrite. So if you put these 4 pieces of Pyrite together, you will get the symphony. Here it is, the symphony, the whole enchilada. And what I'm trying to say by this example, other than to show you some lovely examples of Pyrite, is that the various parts of a larger work, like a symphony or a concerto or an opera or a ballet or whatever they all somehow fit together. Now, that changes over again throughout history. There are some pieces which they don't fit together terribly well, or maybe they're not designed to be inevitably fitting together, but then there are some where they're welded as tight as a a tank. You can't get them apart. They're so inevitably, naturally joined that you could not imagine that any one of these separate parts could belong to anything else. And so the larger forms of music, for the most part, the ones we value the most, the ones that we consider classical, will contain a bunch of parts that will have something in common, some way of resembling each other or having a similar atmosphere or mood or enough in common, whatever those musical qualities are. And they're musical qualities. I mean, again, we don't have to go into them at this point, but they will have enough elements in common that when you are done listening to all four of them, you will feel that you have heard a complete emotional and expressive statement. But because each of those parts has a different shape, a different speed, perhaps it's in a different key, different tunes, different emotional qualities, you may not at first realize that you're listening to one complete composition. You may think, okay, I like this part, but I don't like that part. And that's okay too. If you only like bits, listen to the bits you like. You can listen to whatever you want. But it's good to know in your head that there is something that is joining all of these things together. So that when you listen, you have an open mind. So that you have an awareness of the fact that if Mozart wrote Symphony number 39 and it has 4 different movements, there's a reason. And that reason is audible. You can hear that reason. He doesn't have no one has to explain it to you. No one at all. It's a function of contrast and tension and release and excitement and relaxation and all the different emotional, variety that a composer can pack into a certain piece of music and present as a single unit, even if it has many different sections. And believe it or not, that is really all you need to know to get started listening to classical music, because it's very, very much simpler than you think it is. I mean, those of you who feel somewhat at sea and bewildered, I understand there's just tons and tons of stuff. But if you want to know what it is, that's what it is. The devil is in the details. The devil is in you having enough time to actually sit down and listen to it all and get used to the things that you like and take your time and not rush and not allow yourself to be overwhelmed. You have to go at your own pace. And then we have to deal with the 2 other issues that I raised. Well, we've already dealt with the question of terminology, which was number 3. I think that was actually pretty easy. We've talked about symphonies and concertos and other things, and I haven't defined what those are. But all you need to know is that music comes in little chunks and big chunks, and the big chunks can be broken up into smaller chunks that all go together to form one big chunk. That is classical music. That's really what it is. It really was. And all the rest is just finding something you like to hear and then listening to it a few times until you really know it well. And you understand how all the parts fit together, or you simply just like the little bit that it is. Whatever that is, it's up to you. But there is an issue that we need to deal with, and that issue is one of style. The style in which the composer is working, that the music is written in. And as I said, classical music is many things. It's music of a certain period, a period from about, the 1740s and 50s till about 1830 or so. That was the classical period. And it's music of a very specific number of composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, some of the most famous ones who were born in that period. That's why we call that period classical, because some of the most popular and famous pieces of music were written at that time. And there are other periods, and you'll learn what they are and when they were, and it doesn't matter. But there are also stylistic periods. The classical period featured music written in a particular way. Before that came the Baroque period, which had music written in a particular way. And before that came, well, really nothing that we know of. We call it the Renaissance. Usually we call it by the historical era. Because there's a very interesting thing that happens when we talk about the styles of music. Because after the classical period comes the Romantic period. After the Romantic period, there's the Modern period. Now we're in the postmodern period, whatever that means. These things are very unhelpful as indications of what the music is going to sound like, actually, as often as not. At least when you get very modern and when you get very old. And what happened with our discussion, with our conception of musical periods, is that the closer we get to where we are now, the shorter the periods become, because we tend to hear and make a bigger deal out of small distinctions from one composer to the next or from one decade to the next. Think about pop music. You hear, oh, music of the 70s, music of the 80s, music of the 90s. I mean, it's completely ridiculous when you think about it, because it's not like somebody woke up, a pop songwriter on January 1st, 1990 and said, oh, it's the 90s. I have to do something totally different than I did yesterday, which was the 80s. And it's the same thing with classical music, except with classical music, you're dealing with big chunks of time because it's old. And because it's old, we don't hear the differences between music from the 70s and music from the 80s. We hear differences between music of the 1700s and music of the 1800s. And we call these things different periods. But there are very real stylistic differences over time. I mean, the orchestra, that beautiful symphony orchestra that I was just telling you about, the gorgeous symphony orchestra. Oh, the magnificence of it, right? Well, that's only been around for 200-300 years, maybe, if you want to push it. Before that, there was just vocal music. And most of it was, in fact, sacred vocal music. It was written for the church, because that's all people wrote down. So that's all that survives. It was written to be sung with no instruments, just a choir. And that's what music was. And so to the extent we listen to that music, that's what classical music from that period is. And it has its own stylistic parameters, its own playing forces, its own shape, its own forms, the chunks, the movements, the things that it comes in. And you just get to know it while you listen. You listen and you hear it, and if you like it, you get some, and then you figure out what it is. And then you get more, because if you like that composer, the guy who wrote this piece, chances are that person wrote more. But you have to be ready in listening to classical music to expect very, very different styles. But beyond that. But the point I want to stress people like certain styles, right? Some people like pop music. Some people like heavy metal. Some people like lounge music. There's a million different styles, and everyone has their own personal taste. And so it's exactly the same with classical music. There are a million different styles, and everyone has their own personal taste. However, the important thing to keep in mind is that those chunks that I was talking about, the chunks are the chunks, the movements are the movements. A song written in 1422 is basically identical to a song written last week, because we're talking not about the style in which it's written. Obviously, that's going to sound very different. We're talking about the form of the music itself. The what is it as a chunk of music? And the key, and I mean this, I can't stress this enough, it's the one thing that no one tells anybody, not even people who teach music appreciation. It's a fascinating thing that no one talks about this. The most important thing is to stop thinking about music in terms of songs and think about music in terms of all of the different forms that it can take. Don't think of music as one thing. Think of it as many different, colorful, wonderful things that come in beautiful sizes and shapes. And that will help you more than anything else I say. It really will, because it will change your expectations of what's happening. Once you know that there is going to be a piece of music that's going to be 25 minutes long in several chunks, you're not going to expect to hear what you do now in asking that question. Because in asking the question, how do I get into classical music? You're saying, obviously, I know something about music. I love music. You know you love it. You know you really love it. And your exposure has been limited to whatever your exposure is. I can't say at this point what all of it is. You may be someone who likes instrumental music without words. You may be somebody who only likes music with words, who can't stand the natural, unamplified singing voice that you hear in, for example, operas or classical singers. If you're a song person, I did a whole video about classical songs and the problems they present, because a classical song, one that we kind of, the canon of classical songs, a lot of them were written by a guy named Schubert. He wrote like 600 of them. And therefore, a single voice and a piano, and that's it. You're not going to hear a drum set and rhythm. You're not going to hear electronics. That was the style in the 1810s and 20s, before they had electricity. And so even though the song, here's our song, is going to be just the same thing musically. That is, it may have 3 verses. It's going to be about dying of love. I want you, babe, whatever it is. It might be in German, I want you, Bubble, I want you, mein Liebchen, some other language, who knows. But it musically is going to be very little difference. Stylistically, there will be a difference. And so those are the kinds of things you need to listen for. You need to understand the shapes and forms that music comes in. And I've just told you what they are. It's really that simple. So I hope that this talk, this is going on. It's, I'm looking here, it's like over half an hour. So that's a long talk. And half an hour is about as long as your average symphony, It's about, if you're going to listen to classical music, you got to get ready to listen in half-hour chunks. If you've stayed with me this long, then I think you've probably made quite a bit of progress along the road to listening to the classics. And I am here always with other questions you may have. But this is what classical music is. It's all of the different things that music can be. And so open your mind to the possibilities, find something you like to listen to, and just start listening. And give it as much time as you can. And it will educate you as you go. You really have, if you have love of music, then you have just about everything that you need. And there's nothing else I need to say about it. So keep on listening, my friends. I hope that this was helpful. Take care.